Hello, and welcome to Wavicle, the podcast that reflects on the process of being part of Social Action Inquiry Scotland. We delve into what has emerged for us during this process of being part of the inquiry. We highlight our learnings and unlearnings, and we explore the topics that have been rooted within us. I'm Amanda, and today on the podcast, I am joined by the two co-chairs of the inquiry, Catherine-Rose, or CR for short, and Sam. And I'm also joined by Darryl, who's one of the inquiry's co-leads. And we're exploring together the concept of systems. Before we start the episode, I want to give you a little bit of a flavour about what this episode on systems is about. So have you ever began with good intentions to create a different way of doing things? But at some point along your journey, you realize that things are playing out in exactly the way that you wanted to avoid. That is exactly what this episode is about. We set out to create a different way of doing things, but in the end, the oppressive or harmful systems in place ended up emerging in the work that we were doing. During this episode, I invite you to reflect along the way with us. And we might use the term inquiry within this episode when we're describing certain scenarios. And I invite you to reflect on these situations and think about whether they play out in your life, your workspaces, or your social action spaces. Now let's get into the conversation. Welcome, Darryl, CR, Sam, to this episode about replicating systems. I'd just like to start with a check-in again. Well, because we have quite a few snacks in front of us, which are essential, I'm wondering if you were a snack right now, what would you be that describes how you're feeling?
Good question. I think I'm the snack that I'm eating genuinely rather than it being sort of uninventive. But no, I think I do feel quite spongy. I'm eating this spongy cake that's supposed to be zesty lemon cake, but actually it's just more spongy. And that's how I'm feeling, ready to absorb things.
Thanks, CR.
So I'm happy to go next. I think I resonate most with a digestive biscuit right now. Not a rich tea. Rich tea is sort of a bit too flimsy for how I'm feeling. And the good thing about the digestive is it's robust for dunking in your tea. And so I'm choosing that because just the way I'm feeling in terms of I'm feeling quite resilient and quite strong on the outside. But I know inside a couple of wee dunks and I might be gone for. I think I'm looking forward to the weekend and having a wee break and getting some hours sleep. Not as flimsy as a rich tea, which is usually a one dipper, but a wee bit more robust like a digestive.
Thanks, Darryl. Well, this is a good opportunity for our audience to also take the time to think about what they would be right now.
I'm feeling slightly stumped because I'm drawn to the snacks in front of us and I'm not feeling particularly like any of them, but I'm aware my imagination's like, probably a banana. I do like a banana. I'd feel that way, that banana can make me feel slightly energised, and I find the colour yellow pleasing, feeling quite at ease.
Thanks, Sam. I think I'm going to go with like a mint chocolate, mainly because on my brain I've intentionally left out a mint chocolate to bring with me and I forgot it. So I'm thinking about that. But I guess like feeling quite wholesome. Yes, I count chocolate as wholesome. But also got a little bit of like refreshing from being able to sit down and have these kind of conversations. I find it quite refreshing. So a combination of both of those. But I imagine, no offense to everyone here, but by the end of this, I might need a cup of tea. Mm-hmm. So that's how I'm feeling. And a digestive. And some cake and a banana. So with this conversation about replicating systems, I wanted to take a step back and actually talk about, because this episode and the ones after it are part of our short series on transparency and learning, just wanted to tap into why we chose transparency as a value for the inquiry.
If we're not able to speak to the mistakes we've made and the things we've learned about what didn't work well, we'd be letting inquiry down. And there's a commitment to serve the inquiry best as we can. And to do that, transparency feels key.
Yeah, definitely connect with that, Sam, in the sense that we're trying to be transparent, looking into the world of social action and then the community, what helps and hinders them. But we need to also put back on ourselves and be transparent with what we're trying to do and what we've done wrong and what was unintentional and what we've learned along the way. Because, yeah, it's definitely not the full picture without all those elements.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think there's something too also about transparency as part of how the work is robust. So there's something about it's a value and it's part of the nature of an inquiry in terms of like you need to be honest and transparent about your work. But I think there's something about the practice of transparency being built in means that we're learning as we go. It's not just something that happens at the end of the inquiry where you take stock at the end and think, this is how we would have done it differently, but we're not going to replicate it, so we're just sharing those lessons out. We've actually, I think, been trying to do that all the way through, to support the process.
Not too sure if I have anything different to add to what Sam and CR said, really, other than one of the reasons why I wanted to be a part of the inquiry, I suppose, from the outset, is the idea what helps and what hinders social action, but also the people who are putting this together, the 7 partners who put a lot of resource and finances into communities across Scotland, and to inquire into, is there a different way of doing that, and being transparent about the way we approach it and also about what we find out. And that was a big appeal to me. Also challenging, I'm sure we'll discuss the challenges, not of being transparent, but actually the effect that it could have on the people who are working in a transparent way, because we're all people. I think most people try to do the best that they possibly can. When you know that you've tried your best and actually it didn't really work out, it has an effect. How do you talk about that? How do you work through that?
Thanks, Darryl. CR, I remember you saying this phrase. It stuck with me as someone who's a bit of a perfectionist, so it was a bit jarring at first, but I've come to be quite comfortable with it, about why we should tell stories that aren't necessarily finished yet. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit and why you kind of brought this into this space.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, I think there's something for us around when we had that conversation about telling stories that were unfinished. Some of that was around thinking about coming to the end of the inquiry and what do we share with our collaborators in Scotland, with the partners, with the communities we've been working with, and a sense of something needing to be finished and perfect, as in the inquiry comes to a conclusion and there's this pull to package everything up in a neat way that answers the questions of the inquiry and packages it all up in a way that other people can use. It's not reasonable, and it suggests that we are here doing this work in isolation rather than us being part of a conversation that's been happening for some time, which we are another iteration of, and that conversation will continue. Perfectionism, I think, for me is something that all of that, we know that it kind of sets us up to fail, having these ideas that are actually really divorced from some of the other things that are values for us, the interdependence that we have with what's come before, with what's come after. I think for me, there's something about releasing us from the need to finish and have some kind of final answer that solves a problem. And maybe telling things that are unfinished represents and models the more important bit, which is how. How are things changing? How are things changing now in small ways? And that when you tell an unfinished story, you get to zone in on that because you're in the middle. And I think that's the bit that most people actually need. They don't need, here's a solution. People often understand and know what the solution is. It's how do you get from where you are to the vision that you have. And so staying in that how bit, that middle bit, feels really helpful to me. But yeah, I wonder what others think.
I think it's really important to do something while it's still fresh and live, and there's a risk of sanitising, either deliberately or undeliberately, is our way of managing a disappointment, or over time. It can either get more highlighted or less highlighted. So actually while you're quite fresh and close to the experience, there's a way I think brings something you don't get in a longer reflective back.
Just listening to both what Sam and C are speaking about there, the word action came tip of my tongue really, that sense of the middle, the doing bit, the not looking back or looking at something over a longer period of time. The action and bit, what happens in that space of doing.
I think there's also as well as in that. So there's something about being reflective in the moment or close to the experience, and then also from a distance they bring different things. I was just aware it felt like we were setting up another polarity of this is good and this isn't, rather than them being different.
Yeah, that's interesting you're saying that, Sam, because I'm thinking, the things that we might talk about right now might feel like they're in the past, but the inquiry itself is still very much in that. And what we do now is still going to cause ripples. So I was wondering whether that helps us move into talking about replicating systems. And just before we kick off, when we use the term system, would anyone like to give kind of insight on what they might mean when they say system, or even an example of a system?
I think it's a slippery term, so I think it's worth just saying that language of system sounds abstract, so not that connected to reality. I think for me, systems are patterns. I think what we mean often when we're talking about replicating systems, we're talking about the patterns, particularly, for example, power dynamics and patterns of power and structures of power, whether those are really visible or sometimes invisible. That's one of the things that we're concerned about often. And I think the reason why we use the term system is because that's quite entrenched now. A lot of those power dynamics are very entrenched in the way that we work. So we just assume, for example, that there needs to be funding, for example, that goes into communities, that there needs to be that kind of transfer, that's just a normal arrangement. And so I think we have questions as part of the inquiry about why do we live in a system where that is what's needed rather than everybody having enough.
That was really good. I think it is a good way, and it felt like quite an open way, because otherwise you get specific. So you had patterns, relationships between different things, be that individuals, frameworks, ways of being that are accepted as the norms. So that it's often for me systems that are around what we do habitually and the way it is, or the perceived way. It's done that way because it's done that way.
Yeah, I really like that, what's habitual, the ways that we kind of assume about the way we are, just day by day, yeah. The habits, yeah.
I was just thinking then about I'm allowed to swear? Yeah. So I'm interested with systems is that love-hate relationship with systems. So on the one hand you've got fuck the system, and then on the other hand, we're a part of the solar system, and we usually dismantle systems and replicate them with new systems. And systems kind of give us that knowing, that feeling that we can understand that we might not agree with everything, but it provides a certain sense of security and understanding at the same time as we probably would love to do something different with it. So this sense of replicating systems, or actually not replicating systems, is it actually possible? Because I'm fairly sure that in trying to do a system differently, at some point in history, it's been tried before. And we fall into repeating patterns that we're familiar with, that we're comfortable with, that we can understand. At the same time, we try to create systems that are different, only things are a little bit more fairer, kinder, a new system of being.
I feel like that moves really nicely into talking about one of the scenarios where we envisioned doing things differently and what actually the outcome was.
So yeah, we were looking to create alternative systems. I'm just aware as I sit with the terms, it was about trying to avoid replicating oppressive systems and creating creative systems, or another way of being in relationship.
Yeah, so you're not thinking of the term system to automatically mean harmful system. No. It's a different setup of doing things that actually could be more nourishing. versus being harmful. Thanks for clarifying, Sam.
Yeah. The one that comes to mind that I think is probably, in my experience of the inquiry, I think was one of the ones that was most challenging and also the greatest opportunity for growth. To take Sam's point about, we've tried to create more nourishing, generative, relational ways of working together. And everybody who's joined the inquiry, we've tried to do that. We've tried to ensure that everybody's experience of working in the inquiry is dynamic and full of possibility, and one that fits with where they're at with their lives and the gifts that they have to bring to the work. And I think we've done that in some ways really successfully, and we're all gifted facilitators and know how to create good spaces for people to come together and work together. But we definitely had feedback that our sense of being perhaps really transformational was not experienced by everyone who's worked with us. We definitely had feedback from at least one of the guides who's been part of the inquiry saying, you're assuming that you are kind of in this place, working on the edge of being transformational. And actually my experience of working with you is that you're replicating a lot of other oppressive dynamics. And I think that goes back to that definition of what's habitual. So making certain things that we have all taken for granted, which might be just even how we communicate. Do we use written words? Do we use email? Do we use audio? Do we use video? Do we meet in person? There's a lot of different ways to share information, and we've probably defaulted at times to some forms of sharing information, for example, that might not have been accessible, or we've maybe not made explicit some of the power dynamics that would be very clear and apparent to some people in a room. We maybe came to some of those conversations about power in a slightly reactive way, rather than acknowledging right off the top people might have experiences of oppression in the room. I think we sort of assumed, I would say for myself, I think I assumed we were creating the kinds of spaces that felt like brave spaces for people to be in, and spaces where people could come and work together effectively, but power always plays out, actually. Yeah, I think I was sad, actually, to see that feedback came out, and it was helpful for realizing that I probably have seen some of the work at the inquiry. I've thought about it only in relation to, for example, some of the systems that I know very well about how funders operate or how third sector organizations operate, how policy environments operate. And this does feel very different from those environments. But it maybe feels very oppressive if you're coming from a very organic, flat, non-hierarchical community space. It still feels like there are power differences, who holds information and who shares information, who makes decisions. I think it's really helpful learning to realize that we're always on a spectrum. It's very rare that you're the most transformational, radical, generative person in the room. There's usually somebody else who's further on that edge than you, and it's very important to be respectful of that and come in assuming that that's the case. Yeah.
I just wanted to acknowledge what CR was saying there. Reflecting back on those experiences in that time, and alongside Deborah being one of the facilitators, obviously Amanda, you were involved in the planning as well, the sense of holding the space. I remember a word that really triggered some people. We used that term, holding the space. What we were meaning is that we were providing the environment in terms of the logistics. It was interpreted as though we were the people who were almost controlling what people were saying. That was probably one of the first times in the inquiry when I realised interpretation of language could be really triggering. Basically where people are and also what people are reading. Being aware, what you were touching upon, that there might be someone in the room who is more radical, more progressive. And I won't pretend to think that I am radical or progressive. Bearing in mind, I'm also a white male and I'm aware of that, a white heterosexual male as well. So, in terms of oppression, it's definitely won't be something that I will have experienced regularly or more than a lot of people out there. But actually made me think a lot about the diversity of the people that we had in the room and how we are able to work together as well.
I think there's something in that for me, Rando, that we were holding power because we did hold that boundary and those parameters in terms of that it was around what helps and hinders, and there was aspirations for others that was pushed back, and actually it was about something else. So It links into another podcast around choice points, but we had made the choice that that was what we were engaging with, and the call to do something else with it, we were clear was out with. I mean, I can see why that was experienced as holding power. It was sore, but really helpful in terms of then thinking about, and how is it, as somebody that will disrupt, to experience being disrupted.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the thing that was so helpful for us in that moment, was to, like you say, I think we probably realized at some point in the inquiry that we are all disruptors in lots of spaces that we're in. And then to be experienced as the status quo rather than as disruptors was, a revelation. But I think it goes to this other point about, when are we holding power authentically, because that's our role and responsibility, and it's done in a transparent way, so everyone's understanding and in agreement that there's people holding different responsibilities. And when are we replicating oppressive systems unconsciously?
Somebody who leads us into that, originally around having an independent panel, and we'd opted instead to create roles of guides who were folk that were on the journey with us, helping shape that journey, and the sense that that was going to be quite different. And yet we didn't follow that through in terms of thinking really lively about what would that look like, feel like, be like, and fell into the guides becoming a committee that we were servicing and providing information to, and partly around time. And there's an inequality in how much different roles have within the inquiry, and what that meant in terms of power, and how that's so often what happens in our status quo system, and how it took us a good while to suddenly go, I'll speak myself that bit about this, feels really frustrating. What's going on here? Why are people being passive? Why aren't they stepping in? Well, it's like, because in some ways we've created that. We're providing information, agendas, how it's to be, and holding that. And we continued. I mean, there was a good length of time after that we didn't spot it.
Yeah, and I think it goes to the reflection that actually starting something off in a different way is really exciting, and there's a lot of energy around it, and maintaining that, I think, is what's hard. The status quo, the system wants to pull us back to what's familiar. And so what was familiar, coming together in Edinburgh for 2 days in an amazing space to work together in this very creative way, I think did feel different. But I think the idea of then typing up a summary of that and sending that by email and asking people to reply by email and select the next date for our meeting, and here's the agenda for the next date of the meeting, and all of that is old. So maintaining the energy of doing it differently was hard.
Yeah, and I really feel like that also taps into, we had knowledge of the inquiry that we had to share, but it maybe stayed with us for a longer period of time. People reverted back to that. You have the knowledge and you will share with us. And we've maybe seen that when it comes to, you have resources that you're going to give to us, and we're trying to change that, but equally that might still be a way that we're perceived, or a way that we still act at this point.
When I go back to right at the very beginning for us, it did feel different in the way that we were approaching things. But perhaps we have replicated systems, or I've replicated systems in terms of that relationship at the beginning, in terms of co-chairs. They were here first. They have more experience. They're maybe more in charge than me, And so whether consciously or subconsciously, and a bit of both, though at the time we were working differently, perhaps we could have looked to sense check, are we replicating in some way? What are we feeling about this relationship which is the same as what's already happening, and where is it different? And maybe being able to speak to that and anticipate that.
Yeah, so I think one of our revelations recently has been that perhaps some of the work of the inquiry that we're doing is a bit misaligned from how we like to be working. that there's aspects of it that feel routine, like don't feel like they're pushing us into a different space, either in terms of what we're capable of or in terms of what we think the inquiry needs. That came out in a conversation where Sam and I touched in through some reflective practice to kind of say, how are we? And I kind of sense that maybe there was this kind of misalignment happening. Took us a little while, but we brought that to the wider team and had, I think, a very honest conversation about that sense. Noticing how things feel and making space to ask questions about, like, how are we? How are we actually? But it's interesting, I think, for us, because we were doing check-ins, as we've done on the podcast, we were doing check-ins, but they're daily. They were daily, like, how are we today check-ins, rather than how are we in this work check-ins. In some ways, we've also not put in the kind of systems that might exist if we were creating an organization, of having a kind of set of objectives or a development plan or line management or something like that, where you kind of have that space where you ask people, how are you, and is your work aligned with what you want to be doing? It's like we missed an opportunity because we were deliberately not taking some things from other systems through, but we didn't maybe build something else instead, or we didn't build something sufficient, I think.
And I know for me, there's something about inquiry started to feel like a chore, and it was like, it became very operational. It's not where I get my energy. But there's a resistance, I think, and CR was the one that helped me surface that sense of it being a chore. And it was that resistance because it also feels like such a privilege, and it feels really hard to criticise or for me to or speak to the difficulty in something that it feels a privilege to be involved in. You know, I spent some time thinking about it afterwards, like, what is that about? And that felt like part of it.
Yeah, I would agree. Another thing as well is that not wanting to let other people down. We're a close team. I don't think I was intentionally holding things back, or actually, let me rephrase that. I wasn't intentionally going in and pretending. I think I was aware of when I was thinking, this is a bit of a chore, but not wanting to be that source of negativity or be seen to be like that, when maybe I'm thinking it's maybe just what's going on for me right now, and so keeping that in. And it's just interesting that we all sort of felt that way at roughly the same time, by actually just one person saying, this is what's going on for me. That was that invitation there for us all to be, you know what, yeah, that's kind of been going on for me right now. That was just a thing that was happening at that time. But it created this new space, I think, for us to then reflect about where we are as an inquiry.
Is there anything that our audience, or even, I guess, advice to each other, what can we do to help us check in and notice when we might potentially be replicating a harmful system?
I think part of it is that if you're creating or looking to create something different, think about how it'll look and feel and be if that's been lived. So a real sense of what that is in an embodied way. So you've got something to sense check with, and don't imagine because you relabel something or reframe it slightly that what comes afterwards will just naturally happen because you've got system pressures looking to right themselves back into what is. And we're doing habitually, day to day, what we do within a system. And there's all those learned habits. So how do you disrupt your habits?
I love that, thinking it through, which feels like something very intuitive to do, but I think taking the time to think it through, as Sam describes. And then I think the other thing is noticing what's happening, like, in you. If you're involved in trying to generate something new, how does it feel? So I think what I remember is that there was always stress actually around those, some level of stress around creating the spaces for the guides and for us to come together. And now when I look back to it, I wonder if that should have been a moment where we asked some questions about what's going on. What does the stress feel like? Where's the stress coming from? Because it could have been an indication of misalignment. rather than just, it's a bit of a nightmare to try to figure out how to get 14 hotel rooms or something in Edinburgh on a Friday. Legitimately maybe a bit stressful, but I think there was something deeper going on that might have been a flag, but I don't think we made space to talk about it.
My checkout offering today would be, I guess, asking that question: how do you feel about this work in the inquiry as a snack?
Well, I feel like snap, crackle and pop, the
Rice Krispies.
No, I was thinking of the advert for the Wham bar, talk about influenced by systems. Anybody old enough to remember Wham bars?
Yeah, I remember Wham bars.
Yeah.
You don't get them anymore.
I don't know, my teeth wouldn't take them these days, but that kind of zingy, chewy, zingy, not quite sure when one's going to do which.
Riffing off that, for me it's like strawberry laces. You kind of pull them out of the packet and they're all kind of intertwined and a bit mingly, and you just to kind of separate them, and then after it's like, shove them all in the gubbin and let my mouth work it out. And I think in some ways there's so many intricacies within the inquiry, what we're doing, the communities that we work with, the way that we are with each other.
Like it? Strawberry laces. I think I'm okay, so I'm like, this is maybe, I went to a party once where there was just cakes on a big long table, and I think for many years of my life I've been trying to replicate that party at least once a year, to have people round and there's loads of cakes on a table. So I think that's how I'm feeling. I feel like there's a lot of really wonderful things that are coming out now. Just hoping that, we can get to see and experience them all, like collectively, all on one table.
Yeah, I feel a little bit like a snack that you would kind of chip away at. You're not going to eat like the whole thing at once. It's on the table, but like, oh my goodness, I can't have the whole of this. I'm trying to think, what would that be? Like a big bit of rock or something like that. And like, I'm not going to eat this all in one sitting. And I feel a little bit like that. Just going to chip away a little bit. Eventually something will emerge. So I'd just like to thank both of you for having this conversation today. This will not be the last conversation we have about this, but it's been really nice to be able to sit down together and dedicate the time to talk about it. Thank you for joining us on this episode about systems. I invite you to explore the following concepts in your own self-reflective time. First of all, an invitation for you to notice what patterns, systems, habits, or status quos there are within your life. And secondly, how can you disrupt these potential oppressive or harmful ways of doing things and create something more creative, generative, and nourishing? Thank you again for joining us on the Wavicle podcast. Our episodes are released fortnightly, and we can't wait for you to join us for the next one.